3 years ago, if you thought it came from a lab, if you raised that, you were called a nut job, you got censored on Twitter, you were blacklisted on Twitter, you were even called a crackpot by the very scientist who in late January sent emails to Dr. Fauci and said it came from a lab. They called you crackpot. Is that right, Dr. Redfield?
Let me answer that question for you. The answer is yes. The same scientists that in early January suggested it was from the lab were now saying that you were a crackpot for suggesting that it came from the lab. I'm John F. Gately. Thanks for joining us today. You know, one of the reasons why we're looking into whether it came from the lab was then to ask the subsequent question was how to get out of the lab. Was it an accident or was it on purpose? That is an even more important question. But first we have to discover if it came from a lab, and if it did, why were we redirected to think something else? And today's hearing with Dr. Redfield is revolutionary in our understanding of the situation. Let's get back to it. We're going to pick it up with Representative Maliotokis. Takis. I'm sorry if I mispronounced the name. I think her questioning was by far the best.
On February 1st, Farrer convened a meeting of a group of 11 top scientists across 5 time zones and asked Dr. Fauci to join, and he wrote, quote, "My preference is to keep this group really tight. Obviously, ask everyone to treat in total confidence," unquote. Dr. Redfield, you were excluded from this call, but up until then, you had been on you were included in every other conversation. What changed? Why do you think that you were excluded from these conversations?
Thank you very much. I think just to emphasize, in early to mid-January, I did have multiple calls with Fauci, Farrar, and Tedros about how important I thought it was that science get engaged in aggressively pursuing both hypotheses.
So what he's saying right off the bat is, yeah, I was in phone calls, but I also said we should consider multiple possibilities, or at least 2 possibilities, because then we can perform, I don't know, science to figure it out.
Yes, science!
I also expressed as a clinical virologist that I felt it was not scientifically plausible that this virus went from a bat to humans and became one of the most infectious viruses that we have for humans.
Not scientifically viable that it went from a bat to a human.
Now, why do you think you were excluded from those calls?
Because it was told to me that they wanted a single narrative and that I obviously had a different point of view.
Now, they should have followed up and said, oh, who told you that? But unfortunately, they didn't ask that question.
What is the likelihood that these scientists came across additional information just 3 days after making these statements to conclude with such certainty that COVID-19 came from nature instead of the lab leak that they thought it was 3 days earlier?
Yeah, I think it's unfortunate. Again, I've said this before, that this whole approach that was taken on February 1st and subsequently in the month of February, if you really want to be truthful, it's antithetical to science.
Antithetical to science. That's harsh talk from a scientist, especially when you're talking about Dr. Fauci, who declared himself science. He is science.
Do you think that the paper does hide the truth?
I think it's an inaccurate paper that basically was part of a narrative that they were creating. Remember,
he's talking about the paper known as Proximal Origin, which was the paper that they decided to write on February 4th. Remember, on February 1st, the scientists thought it came from the lab, but by February 4th, they were like, oh no, it came from the wet market, you know, that dirty wet market. And now they're talking about that paper that they wrote and that Fauci subsequently quoted from at the White House in April. They're talking about the paper that basically he was excluded from drafting, and he was not part of this working group of about a dozen scientists discussing the sources of the virus.
This pandemic did not start in January at the seafood market. We now know there was infections all the way back into September. This was a narrative that was decided that they were going to say this came from the wet market, and they were going to do everything they could to support it, to negate any discussion about the possibility that this came from a laboratory.
I got 20 seconds left. Dr. Fauci was affirmatively told in an email that NIAID had a monetary relationship with the Wuhan Institute through EcoHealth Alliance. He was told this in January 27th of 2020.
Follow the money, right? She's setting up the big question here. Pay attention.
Do you think that Dr. Fauci intentionally lied under oath to Senator Paul when he vehemently denied NIH's funding of gain-of-function research?
Did Dr. Fauci intentionally lie about gain-of-function research?
I think there's no doubt that NIH was funding gain-of-function research.
Whoa. Now, he doesn't actually call Fauci a liar, but he basically refutes what Fauci said.
Is it likely that American tax dollars funded the gain-of-function research that created this virus?
I want you to listen to that question again.
Is it likely that American tax dollars funded the gain-of-function research that created this virus?
I think it did, not only from NIH, but from the State Department, USAID, and from DoD.
From NIH, State Department, USAID, and DoD. Basically, multiple agencies across the federal government help produce the coronavirus, COVID-19, according to Dr. Redfield.
I'm out of time. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Representative Nicole Malliotakis. I think I've got that name right. I'm guessing it's a name we'll hear much more of in the future. If she had much more time, what she could have accomplished much. She was very, very efficient in questioning Dr. Redfield. And the point here is that quite clearly the federal government funded the research in China, which then produced the coronavirus epidemic. And so now the only really question is how did it get out of the lab? Accident or on purpose? From Plymouth, America's hometown, I'm John F. Gately in Massachusetts. Behind enemy lines. Have a great day.